So after having the chance to play the closed beta for Project Resistance, I can safely say that I enjoyed what I played, and I look forward to the full release. Obviously there are things like balance fixes and other significant additions that would be nice to have, such as the ability to combine herbs and using defensive items, but again, I think that the overall experience of the closed beta has made a pretty good impression on me, and I'm very excited to see what's going to come at the full release. That being said, for today's video I wanted to focus on some of the things that I'm speculating about the game as far as lore, the little nods to the classic games that might be hinting us at a potential Resident Evil 3 remake in the foreseeable future, as well as what I assume or what I hope to see happen with post-launch content such as DLC expansions and small events and stuff like that. But we'll get to that towards the end. That being all said, that's what I wanted to focus on. So if you wanted to hear my thoughts on the actual gameplay side of things, there's actually a discussion that I did with my friend DevilHunterJames because he had access to the closed beta as well. And we talked an hour about some of the things that we thought about in our first impressions of the beta. So if you want to go check it out, there should be an iCard somewhere in the corner, and if not, then there should be a link down in the description below that you can check out, so that way you can go ahead and watch that if you want to hear my thoughts on the beta as well as another person's thoughts on the beta. Anyway, I wanted to get started with discussing the lore first, since I think there is quite a bit to talk about and speculate over. To start off, I think that we should discuss the mastermind that was available during the closed beta. Daniel Fabron is actually somewhat interesting just because he actually has some connections to Oswald E. Spencer along with Alex Wesker. And the reason why I find him interesting in particular is that because I initially speculated that he was actually Albert Wesker, because what we saw in the teaser trailer, there was somebody wearing a black suit with a tie and all that, and Daniel isn't really wearing that stuff. But given his connection to Alex Wesker, it's made me speculate and think that maybe both Weskers are actually within the game. And that would actually make sense given the timeline that this game is taking place within during the lore. So this could somewhat be supported by the fact that you also have the leak that happened during the beta. And this kind of was not intended just because of the fact that there was a glitch within the beta. So somebody had noticed that within the glitch that had occurred, you can actually have Annette Birkin as one of the masterminds. So if there's that character as a playable mastermind, then perhaps other characters such as Albert and Alex Wesker are going to be potential masterminds. There's the possibility that we could also see maybe Alfred Ashford or Nikolai and other characters that were alive within this particular time period of the Resident Evil lore and universe. I think that it would make sense for the most part, considering the fact that you do have multiple playable survivors with set skills. So on the flip side, at least with masterminds, they could potentially have their own set skills as well, on top of the fact that maybe certain masterminds are keen to using particular tyrants and stuff like that. Like Daniel is using Mr. X because that's the only tyrant or boss-like enemy that you can control and play as. But imagine if you can play as one of the G embryos, or hell, you could play as the proto tyrant or something like that. I think that would be really fucking cool. Or if they delved even deeper and took stuff from the Outbreak games, because I've recently been playing a lot of Outbreak on emulation, and some of the enemies that were in those games could probably work very well in Project Resistance. I'm just saying. But then there's also something too, and I think that even though this game might probably only focus on mostly stuff that's canonical to this particular time period within the lore and universe, they could also take some things that might not be canon, or just things that are a little off because it wouldn't make sense for this particular time period. Maybe they could take in some enemies from RE4, 5, and 6, but I'll talk about that later. For now, let's just focus on this. And yeah, I am going a little bit off topic, but I will say that the possibility of playing other antagonists that appeared within the Resident Evil universe, especially within this particular time period, whether they be mixed in with old antagonists or even new antagonists, I think there's very interesting possibilities that we can see come out of this. Anyway, I think some of the things that we could expect to see from the Masterminds is some minor additions to lore as far as like files go and potential context to certain character backstories and whatnot. Personally, while I was not a fan of Alex Wesker and the way that character was handled, I think with additional lore, they could improve that character for the long run. Like, perhaps the Masterminds are characters that could be associated with her in some capacity, such as aiding her in research or helping her developing bioweapons and things of that nature. Perhaps some of the characters that we could see, at least as far as Masterminds go, could have some ties to her as far as like what happens within Revelations 2. Also, since we know now that Annette is in the game as a mastermind, there could be that potential where we could see characters linked to her and William as far as how the G-Virus was created and who helped make the G-Virus aside from just William and Annette Birkin. Anyway, I think it's time that we move on and discuss the small possible hint towards Resident Evil 3 Remake. Now, I know a lot of people, for whatever reason, are up in arms about Project Resistance simply existing and not seeing the Resident Evil 3 Remake now. However, I think what people need to remember is that it took us quite a bit of time before we saw the Resident Evil 2 Remake, despite it being announced to us years prior. Also, something to note is that we only just got Resident Evil 2 Remake at the tail end of January, so it would seem like it would be too soon to see a Resident Evil 3 Remake now as opposed to sometime in the foreseeable future. Now, that's not to say that it isn't impossible for the game to be in development now. It just means that we won't know about it for quite some time. Also, something to consider as well, just given the fact that we're on the cusp of seeing the next generation consoles, it wouldn't come as a surprise to me if Capcom wanted to save the development for Resident Evil 3 Remake for the PlayStation 5 and the next generation Xbox. That, to me, at least, just makes sense. I don't think I really need to explain why they would do that, and I have been diverting from the main subject at hand, so just let me address why I think Capcom and Neobards Entertainment were alluding to the remake. In save rooms, you could hear a radio playing some of the save room themes from the original Resident Evil, the original Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3. Now, I'm not sure if there were other themes that were possibly being played, such as the Resident Evil Code Veronica, Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 7 save room themes, but those three in particular were the ones that I was able to notice. I should also point out that they specifically used the original themes for Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 and not their remake counterparts. Of course, that could just be a little Easter egg acknowledging the past games as well as the time period that the games are taking place within the lore. However, I think that Capcom, knowing how well the Resident Evil 2 remake sold, they don't want to repeat the same mistake that they made with the first Resident Evil remake by waiting for a very, very long time before actually remaking Resident Evil 2. And I think that that would probably be the smart way to go about it, is to do it as soon as possible as opposed to waiting almost 2 decades before actually deciding to remake the most popular game within a franchise, or at least in this case, a game that is right off the cusp of the most popular Resident Evil within the franchise. Another thing to keep in mind as well is that Capcom at one point did express interest in remaking the Resident Evil remakes, so there is potential of seeing more remakes in the future. Also, something else to consider is that Project Resistance could be a way to just hold people off while they wait for the Resident Evil 3 remake or Resident Evil 8 or whatever next game comes after this particular game. Not to mention that some of the assets could probably get carried over within this game over to the Resident Evil 3 remake, because something else to consider too is that this game is technically taking place within Raccoon City, so it would be easy to just carry over assets and reuse certain textures, things of that nature, just because, well, a lot of the environments or a lot of the aspects of Resident Evil 3 is just you going from point A to B throughout the city. So I could honestly see them taking a lot of assets and textures and things of that nature from Project Resistance and applying that to Resident Evil 3 Remake. And I guess this leads us into the last subject I wanted to cover for today's video, and that is post-launch content. Given that this isn't a traditional Resident Evil game, I would hope to see some post-launch content, maybe handled in a similar fashion to other multiplayer games, or even a better example, to Monster Hunter. Granted, I don't think that it will get the same level of support as some of those games, especially Monster Hunter, because Capcom really spoils Monster Hunter players. But again, that's a whole nother subject, and I don't really see them doing that. But the general premise of content updates and small little events for cool unlocks on top of like maybe 1 or 2 major expansions, I could definitely see something that would probably benefit the game overall. I think that we could probably see some post-launch content, and my guess would be is that if they do end up doing that, that it could be a mix of canonical and non-canonical DLC expansions. Like you could have some that focus more so on the environments within Raccoon City, but then on the other hand, if they were to go for the more non-canonical stuff, then maybe they could pull something like really crazy and have you go through like Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 environments and go up against enemies from those games and stuff like that. But again, that's something that we'll have to wait and see on, and I would like for them, again, to do some post-launch content, but it's going to have to be a wait and see, and maybe they will go that route, maybe they won't. Again, we'll have to wait and see. Ironically enough, though, I think that waiting to work on this video actually kind of worked in my favor, because Capcom Japan also announced another VR title, and this time it's actually a 4-player co-op spin-off to Resident Evil 7. Granted, that doesn't mean that they'll still use some of the stuff found within Resident Evil 4 through 7 as like potential DLC and content updates, but the possibilities are still there. Although I think the more maybe likely scenario would be some references to Code Veronica and mostly a focus on Resident Evil 2 and 3 lore stuff. That's my guess. But even then, only time will tell, and chances are this is just more of myself rambling and wishfully thinking. That being said, I really don't have much else to say. I know that content has been coming out infrequently. I'd hoped for it to come out more frequently, but unfortunately things like real life take up priority. That is something that might change though. I am getting into that holiday season period at work. So with that in mind, that is something that might impact the content that's coming out. But then again, I'm also at like almost borderline tail end of my semester at school, so that might balance out. We'll have to just kind of wait and see. But what I'm hoping for, at least for content in the future, is that I'll have at least 1 or multiple videos coming out within a 1 to 3 week period, depending on what I would want to talk about and if there's anything that any subject in particular that would interest me to talk about it. Otherwise, I'd be focusing mostly on reviews and taking that time to work on the reviews that I'd already had planned out, so I can finally move on from talking about just Resident Evil 4 review stuff. But again, we'll have to wait and see how that all balances out. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Let me know down in the comment section below what you thought. Were there some things that I might have overlooked or kind of pushed aside? Did you want to elaborate on some of the things that I had discussed in today's video? Let me know. And also, if you liked today's video, feel free to give it a like, maybe even share it and subscribe. And with that, I will see you all in the next one. Matane.